Very good motivation. Then we submitted it. Yes. I mean, I don't know. And also we do it in the game. Yeah.
So most places now and then after that it's flexible. A lot of students want to stick in on MA they're not taking
That was 15, right? Yeah. I'm also in touch with you here because we work here on a fashion factory. And the day I was here, she was right there.
I've always encouraged them to attend classes in the area a lot of the problems with the English system, some of the technical design degrees
I mean, maybe it's
you're going to have to ideas and materials also because you have expectations, it's not so much. They're just Miss Number is this is a very yeah, no, it's really great. No, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's great. I'm good. I'm just on my way to Sorry? No, I'm saying. Can I go come back and go? Oh, yeah, it's a little bit embarrassing. Yeah, no, I don't know whether I'm expecting to be honest. Yeah, no, she's speaking of that. I'm so stupid. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sorry. No, yes, sorry.
Online.
Your presentation is on there already.
May I have everybody's attention, please? Hello, everyone. Good morning. Hello. Hi, I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of Loughborough, London to Moving Media Memory History Conference today. I'm Divis, this is Julia, we are part of the organizing team, and we would like to welcome everyone who's joined us from all the different countries and different universities. Thank you so much for coming. I would just like to briefly welcome everyone to the presenters and the panel chairs who've made it here and who are part of today's conference. I would like to thank the funding bodies, Loughborough University Centre for Research in Communication and Culture, particularly Professor Sabina Mihail, Dr. Emily Keatley, who's heading the MLPI project that has also funded this conference today, the Institute for Media and Creative Industries based in Loughborough, London, who is also part of the funding body. Thank you to Julia, Nathan, and all the PhD students who have helped us organize today's conference. And lastly, I would like to thank Andrew Hoskins and Loughborough, who are here today and who will be doing the keynote presentations. Thank you so much once again for coming and being part of our conference. And I'll hand it over to Julia now.
So we're going to start with a keynote by Andrew Hoskins, and then we're going to have one panel before lunch. And after lunch, we're going to have parallel sessions. So you basically have to make up your mind which one you would probably see. And one will be there, one will be here, and we kind of put the separation. And after that, we're going to have a film screening of a film that Aftermath, together with many other people, created in the 90s, and a Q&A. That will be followed by a wine reception and then a dinner for everybody who presented today. Quick introduction of Andrew Hoskins that I will read out, so I don't make a mistake. Andrew Hoskins is an interdisciplinary research professor at the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow. His latest books are Trump's Media War, which is co-edited by Catherine Happer and William Marin, Digital Memory Studies, Media Past and Transition, and Risk of Hyperconnectivity, Media and Memories of Neoliberalism, which he did together with John Tulloch. Hoskins is founding editor-in-chief of the Sage Journal Memory Studies, founding co-editor of the Palgrave Macmillan book series Memory Studies, and founding co-editor-in-chief of the New Journal of Digital War. His current research is for the book entitled Memory in the Head and the Wild with Amanda Bernier, exploring the challenges of interdisciplinarity in memory studies. Please welcome Andrew Hoskins.
You reading that out just makes me feel really tired. Many thanks to Julia and her colleagues and everyone at the Migrant and Memory Host Colonial Imagination Network for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. There's some really exciting and interesting work being presented today. So I'm here not really to present, I'm here to learn. It's a fantastic day. Okay, so individual, personal memories are made to be said to be important because they are human. But individual memories have always been influenced by factors external to the self. And that has long been the conundrum of memory studies, the shifting balance of the relationship between memory in the head and memory in the wild. And it is media that have long been said to extend and strengthen individual and group and societal memory. And in recent years, these metaphors and ideas and concepts have proliferated. Memory is said to be prosthetic, extended, networked, connective, multidirectional, etc., etc. Writing, printing, and electronic media in successive phases have transformed human cognition and the capacity, control, and power to remember. And, you know, as I said, technological progression is said to equate to an advancement of memory and its kind of human mastery. And memory as such is constantly renewed by the memory technologies of the day. In this way, memory is always new, as the same media shaper. Also, a reassessment of the very value of remembering and forgetting. But today, for me at least, digital media and technologies mess up this relationship. The idea that memory in the wild simulates memory in the head through artificial intelligence and machine learning gives us the kind of self-learning and self-leading archives of social media, a memory that is in some ways beyond living memory, and a myriad of ways of being forgotten and unforgotten. And it's not just that AI and data kind of unsettle the past, in that memory today is this kind of new, paradoxical and unpredictable life, but they also challenge the canon of memory still is, its concepts and parameters, its theories and methods, and I'm happy to talk more about that later if you want me to. So this presentation then asks, what are the prospects for human remembering and forgetting under these conditions? And to do this, I use the idea that we're living through a time of the algorithmic past. And that, the algorithmic past, as I see it, is that which lurks in new and unpredictable ways in the present, and which paradoxically both opens up and closes down the possibilities of the future in what memory is and what memory does. So I just want to give a few overview of some of these elements and focus in on a few of them as I go along. So as I said, individual human memory has long been seen to have been augmented by the storage and representational, reproductive and connective capacities of technologies and media external to the South. But today the idea of an active, willed, functional, deliberating human memory as fundamentally part of human identity that healthily changes with time is threatened by a shift from a kind of healthy reliance on technologies and media to a dependency, an addiction, definitely addiction, a placing of the past beyond our control. So memory in the wild has seized memory in the head, and a key driver of this process is datafication. And this is the constant generation of data about people, their acts and events, that a new form of power is excisable by those with access to databases, processing power, and data mining expertise, to cite Andreevich. But what is distinctive about today's media age is that this embedding is no longer a matter, as I said, about reliance, but more a dependency. Datafication is more a matter of who has control over what the past will become and who the self will become known, unknown, seen or unseen. But the problem is, of course, the nature and effects of datafication are obscured by the promotion of this, a new cultural and political force of what I call the digitally fostered values of openness, of unbridled commentary, open access, freedom of information, the right to know, the immediacy of instant search, and so on, and confessional culture, which all feed on and provoke this kind of relentless pulse. And these have an array of kind of unforeseen consequences, not just for individuals, but also institutions whose business is memory. For instance, a former member of staff at the National Archives told me recently the archives are hemorrhaging visitors as people believe they can access everything online. And the reliance and the capacity of digital search can mean paradoxically less is found. For instance, in the kind of interpretive complexity embedded in the material and in the contextual marsh of paper records, as I've argued elsewhere in relation to the digital risks to the future history of warfare. And how conscious are we, or could we be, of the hum of the technological unconscious? Nigel Thrift calls it the algorithms that shape what we see and what we don't. So in some ways we're suffering from this diminished media conscious. You know, can we ever look under the hood of contemporary media and know exactly where ourselves are located and used. The individuals become networked, but also archived, searchable and ultimately accountable for every communication, every message, every personal or social act requiring media. And our basic everyday communicational acts are archival. We scatter digital traces of ourselves just through being social, through working, or even by doing nothing. Information pours out of our smartphones as we sleep. Social media is a form of living archive, a constantly evolving record of the everyday, defies our traditional categories and certainties of media provenance, ownership, duration, and decay. And Wolfgang Ernst nicely summarises this shift. Although the traditional function of the archive is to document an event that took place at one time and one place, the emphasis in the digital archive shifts to regeneration, co-produced by online users for their own needs. And it's this idea of kind of user-generated needs that puncture trust, especially when the living archive of social media that is both personal and public, in ways like no other archive, enables distortion and manipulation and the curation of convenience. Or another way to put that is that these digital supreme public archives make the past, memory and history vulnerable to hacking on a huge scale. So whereas media audiences once had a kind of collective anonymity in their media consumption of the 20th century, today's digital media ecology users are more and more personally accountable. And the prospects for, of course, aspects of your life, hacks, traces emerging at unpredictable times in the future are massively increased. So we're all burdened by this kind of unwieldy and uncontrollable memory in the world. So whereas, say, in the broadcast media age we had a fairly predictable grasp of what I call decay time of the media of the day. That is, pre-digital media forms were fairly reliable in their lifespans, and the dissipation of recorded memory of a given society over time. Today there is a profound uncertainty between the extremes of accidental deletion on the one hand and the need for the right to be forgotten on the other. Hence the growing popularity of messaging apps, which offer, or seem to offer, the prospects of a definitive limit of the existence and availability of a sent message, image or video. So Snapchat, for instance, or the now defunct Yik Yak. More broadly, there is a kind of growing memorialization of the digital present, a haste, a rage for commemoration and memorialization of events before they are even finished. The past is being rewritten, pulled down and ripped apart, not in what were once thought of as kind of collective and consensual ways. The societies have always recast their present in light of their past in light of present needs, but instead in ways driven by polarization and division and exclusion, and also in ways that are used and employed to actually distract from the problems of the present. And overall, we can say that the algorithmic past shapes new kinds of forgetting. Faced with overload, it is discarding that becomes important. And surely that is precisely what algorithms direct in their automation and selection and narrowing of the world out there through our search and consumption. At the same time, and I think these things are related, today's present seems particularly intolerant and unwilling to speak of the past crimes of those whose names were, for instance, central to popular culture. Jimmy Savile, Kevin Spacey, Michael Jackson. Digital culture both underpins a contemporary desire to erase, and yet makes it almost impossible not to confront such characters, be they dead or alive. So, there's a lot of work now being done about the idea that technology and media that document our world diminish our experience of it, But this is not a new idea by any means. For instance, in a 1975 essay, the novelist Walker Percy describes a man who arranges a tour of the Grand Canyon. But the man's experience is obliterated by the 40 years worth of seeing and hearing about it. So instead of confronting the experience anew, he photographs it. So seeing the canyon is made even more difficult by what the sightseer does when the moment arrives, when sovereign Noah confronts the thing to be known. Instead of looking at it, he photographs it. There was no confrontation at all. At the end of 40 years of pre-formulation, and with the Grand Canyon yawning at his feet, what does he do? He waves this right of seeing and knowing and record symbols for the next 40 years. For him, there is no present. There is only the past of what has been formulated and seen, and the future of what has been formulated and not seen. The present is surrendered to the past and the future. But today we live in an age of the obsessive recording of everything, part of what I've called a compulsion connectivity, or hyperconnectivity if you prefer. Be this mundane or exceptional, public or private, and this includes attempts to arrest experience through the live capture, the mundane and extraordinary, through live logging, live streaming, GoPro, of course the real or later time sharing of all of that which is recorded. And there's some interesting experimental work in psychology by Henkel, for instance, that shows that the act of photographing objects in a museum adversely affects the individual memory of those objects. So they just do a simple experiment. People go around the museum without one of these. You know, it's difficult, I know. And a few days later, they ask them about their memories of the museum. And then another group, they ask them to take lots of photographs. And the group that took all the photographs and recorded stuff as usual remembered less in that kind of context. But for me, I think we can now say that the act of recording has become more urgent than the experience of that which is being recorded. Human imagination no longer seems sufficient for remembering. Instead, memory equates to having seen some kind of image or video for it to exist and to be valued. In another way, at the same time, there's a kind of pursuit of total memory. There's something achievable and desirable to digitize everything, to archive everything. And as Jeff Boker points out, this vision is kind of paradoxical. We never quite have enough data to see everything, to kind of get a grasp on our digital lives, and yet our archival practices obfuscate what we can't see. And in terms of individual identity, what is fundamentally different with AI and data today is this idea, the remembered self. And this book is a quarter of a century old, I think. That is the long established idea that there's been a desire or intent to attain a sense of the entire self that is forged in memory. But the self was never really that coherent construct. And now there are new possibilities and risks to its existence if we think of the remembered self as a series of data points. A data point is at its simplest an item of information about you. Okay? So in pre-industrial times, in parish records, individuals were preserved in roughly 3 data points, baptism, marriage and death. And they didn't even list kind of date of birth until much later, I think, with baptism seen as the most important moment. So if you're lucky enough to have a headstone, you would probably have full data points on it, name of spouse perhaps and children. In fact, we can say that the vast majority of people in Western Europe probably survived in only 2 to 3 data points for their entire lives for a very long time. I nicked this slide by the way. my good friend William Merrin, so I thought I'd best do the decency of crediting him. He gave a talk on that which remains, which you might be able to find online a few weeks ago. But so 3 data points, we go to 2016, Cambridge Analytica had a database of around 5,000 data points on each of 200 million Americans. Combined with the Republican Party's own voter data to model how persuadable its members were. So now if we begin to think across history of the sheer potential for the existence and the use and the persistence of the remembered self in terms of data points, a number of new risks emerged. The remembered self becomes vulnerable to the uncertainty of these data points being circulating, being used and harvested, but also the sheer existence of these data points beyond the traditional understood limits of the self. And the algorithm intervenes. Part of this new invisibility is part of the greater potential of being disclosed, the greater risk of what I call emergence, as I've called it a few places. And in this way, it's algorithms that fundamentally transform the relationship between past, present, and future. So, as Shani Leopold suggests, what the world looks like to you today and who you are seen to be this afternoon is constructed from the datafied scraps of what you did last night. So what kind of a remembered self emerges under such conditions? Well, most contemporary approaches to remember treat memory as an active process, whereby the past is reconstructed in the present. Hence, what is remembered is not some more or less accurate trace of the past, but rather a remaking or a revisioning of past events which are significantly shaped by the context of recall. And this view of memory as the making active of the past in the present can be traced back to the writing of Bartlett, 1932, early 20th century, had a major influence on the psychology of memory. It's interesting, the past 15 years his work has kind of come back again, if you see what I mean. And Bartlett claimed that the key process of remembering involves the introduction of the past into the present to produce a kind of reactivated site of consciousness. But increasingly this attitude to a mass of organised past reactions or experiences, as Bartlett puts it, is critically manipulated invisibly and routinely through the function of algorithms. So the past inhibits, in some ways, rather than helps the formation of new human memories. Or put another way, algorithms function as interference, where old memories disrupt new ones. Wally Sauter, for instance, identifies 3 memory systems of predictive text, reminiscence databases, such as Facebook memories, or time hop, that represent images or events that it determines, of course, that are significant from your social media timeline. And also she refers to data doppelgangers, those ads that follow us around the internet. And the core strategy of these models, Sauter neatly suggests, is those whose past is legible will be exhorted to repeat it. And the idea of Bartlett's human agent actively and deliberatively remembering is challenged with the seemingly active operations of AI. For instance, images are seen to be primary in the anchoring and persistence of memory. Ask any cognitive psychologist. But today, with humans increasingly taken out of the loop of algorithmic circulation, reproduction and archiving, the image becomes a new force in itself. And as the artist Trevor Pagden explains. And Pagden also goes on to say, and I quote from him again, images have begun to intervene in everyday life, their functions changing from representation and mediation to activations, operation and enforcement. And there is a kind of a critique here also that runs parallel from the work of Richard Grusin and myself and Ben O'Loughlin and others have written on this for a long time now, about the importance of the shift from simply from representationality to mediality. in terms of if you want to understand where the meaning of the matter of memory is located. It's less about what is the accuracy of what is being represented, more about mediality. So mediality, what we do with media, the sharing, the linking, the liking, the hacking, and that's a shift that media studies hasn't caught up with yet, in some people's opinion. So, when I talk about memory in the wild, then this is really literally about an archive beyond human memory. What all this adds up to then is a memory beyond the self. The algorithmic generation of identity is not necessarily about what you say or who you are, but rather identification based upon what you do, where you go, who you communicate with. This is finding, paradoxically, the unknown and unremembered individual. Capturing data of interest here is this kind of called pattern of life activity, the metadata movements, networks of contacts, mobile phone use. And the clustering of pattern of life data around an individual, what they like and shop and where they live and travel, is enough to shape an identity that they didn't even know existed in the first place. And this kind of emergent identity, how we see and how we are seen, constructed from these datafied scraps of what we did last night in Shani Lippold's terms, brings us back to Bartlett's definition of memory. Remembering is less and less about our attitude to the mass of organised past reactions or experience, and rather more about the algorithms that organise this mass of past experiences in the first place. The remembered self, then, that experience we have of the whole of ourselves and the continuity of our identity, relations and being in the world, is kind of given up, or hostage, if you like, through our profound connectivity and dependency upon digital networks. And people often talk about the digital traces that we leave behind as part of our all-accumulating past, including the end of living memory, digital death. There's a number of books and important work in this area now. But for me, rather, we need more urgently to interrogate data and algorithms as active components of a past, which is now all over, and to attend to the uses and abuses of what I call this unremembered self. So, similarly, that the right to be forgotten should be reconfigured perhaps as a right not to be known. Okay, I think I'll just sum up very briefly, then plenty of time to talk. I've argued that our everyday and pervasive acts of digital communication and the forging of connections feel lively, mediality, feel lively. We feel also these activities feel under our control. With the comfort of immediacy and the comfort of instant action. But this actually belies a diminishment of our consciousness of media. And ultimately, digital existence weakens what was once an active memory, a human memory, that had to work hard to sustain a continuity of past, of identity, of place, of relationships, with a shift from, as I've said, from reliance to dependency on the search devices of AI and our machines. And, memory in what I call our post-scarcity culture is less about remembering and more about being unremembered in a human sense. And this growing dependency on an algorithmic past without clear finitude and driven by the kind of compulsion of connectivity, distracts in some ways from a world that kind of slips out of focus, in which memories of a wider social significance become impossible to grasp. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
So we have no time for questions. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. So are there questions already, or shall I start? So I have a question. in private conversations I have the feeling that when I talk to people younger than me, that they're actually much more critical with their use of social media and what they put online than I have, and that actually my parents actually, especially my mother, is putting it all out there. Why do you think that is, that there are people that are more aware now of what that move?
Yes, I think it varies. It's there, you know, there's some very interesting work on generational uses of media and memory. You know, I guess there are, you know, I think there are still two poles of argument really. One is that the digital natives, those born digital, are much less aware in many ways of an array of risks and threats. And the other argument is the one you just put, in terms of a greater awareness or sensitivity to what it means to live life digitally. So I think the truth is probably somewhere between the two, perhaps. You know, some work that we've done has shown a slightly younger age group to be really savvy about, you know, people talk about the way people use Facebook or social media in a very kind of general way, but actually I think you're right in the sense that particularly younger people, younger generations are very particular about the modes of communication they use on very different social media platforms. So in our research and focus groups, there was, you know, some people are much more open in terms of the language and the revelation of themselves and their lives on much more community-based platforms. So like Discord, which is a you know, platform for gamers, for instance. You know, there is a sense of the kind of, you know, a shared community coming online and an element of trust because you've got a shared set of interests. So, but overall, I think the evidence is mixed. So that's why I'm kind of hedging my answer to your question. I think there's evidence for, you know, a kind of a wild oversharing on level, and a really acute sense of risks on the other. And I think both. I don't think we're clear about which one is really winning through.
Any other? Thank you, that was so interesting.
Thank you.
Do you think that we can talk about machines or technology or algorithms as creating memory or performing memory or constructing memory, or are they doing, or is that still considered something that can only be done by people? Does that have to be still attached to the individual? Are we then talking about something else when the machine becomes involved?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess it depends upon, you know, what you define and how you distinctly you separate human memory from machinic or media memory. You know, and you know, actually in my talk I kind of blur my concepts and the metaphors, you know, between the two, and I'm aware of that. So I guess my answer to your question is, well, how do we arrive at an understanding to enable an answer to your question? And for me, it's a matter of what I'm hopefully doing now, which is working in an interdisciplinary way. I mean, I'm a, you know, media sociologist really, even though people call me many other things, including those words I can't repeat today. But working with cognitive scientists. So I'm working with a cognitive scientist, Amanda Barney, on a project that actually tries to get a sense of, you know, what is this difference between memory in the head and in the wild? And can we really compare? You know, can we really use the same concepts and language? Because the histories of our subjects are so different and distinct, are we really talking about memory in the same way, which is what your question is getting at? And that's a really hard, you know, and I mean, Amanda Barney and I, we've known each other, so we're good friends for well over a decade, so, you know, we can be very honest with each other, you know, and I use these concepts that many people would find very familiar here, and she would say, well, what on earth did that mean? You know, so in terms of the starting point of getting a shared language between disciplines which might begin to start opening your question, including that, of course, in computer science, I think it's, you know, we're still at the very beginning of that, and people talk about memory studies, you know, and, you know, okay, I did the general memory studies, but, you know, it strikes me that some people have a very, very narrow idea of what that is. You know, there's a whole world of memory out there that we don't publish in the Journal of Memory Studies because it's published in the Journal of Memory, which is for psychologists, really, cognitive scientists. And how we bring those two words together, plus computing science, I think, is the holy grail for me, and it's very difficult.
I very much like your concept of the surrendered past, surrendered present, and I was wondering whether this ability to enjoy a concert because you're filming it for the future, and then in the future to be remembered of the past, whether this has anything to do with this obsession to relive the past in the future, embodied by such slogans as "Make America Great Again" or "Taking Back Control." Do you think you can make a connection between this on the individual level and on the social level?
That's a really interesting question. I don't really have an answer to that, but that's a very interesting line of thinking. I mean, there's a number of ways to think about why we, not we, me included really, walk around the world like this. I guess initially when it first happened, I was just confused by it. I was of a generation, obviously, a pre-digital generation, pre-mobile phone generation, that I'd go to a concert, because I want to go to a concert, I want to see, and experience a performance. Part of that experience performance is seeing. So I was very confused really and annoyed by people who put their phones up in front of me. And I wondered if it was something about just part of the ritual of being in the crowd. So maybe there's some ritualistic element about being part of the collective mass, all doing the same thing. If it's, like you'd hold candles up or lights up or whatever concert. And I thought, well, maybe that is it. But no, there's definitely something more going on. In terms of, the question is really interesting because it, forces us to think about the future and about what that stuff is being recorded means in the future. And in some ways, I think it's meaningless. Because it's the moment that's the important thing, in the terms of we feel we need to capture it now. So it's something about the experience and perception of the present, about acting in the present. Recording is about performance in the present. Because if we really think about it, in all the stuff we record, how much is it impossible in a human way to play it all back or see it all back again? Okay? So functionally, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to record everything. Because we can never watch it all again, and we can never manage it all again. So it makes no sense at all. So that's why I think your question is really interesting. It may, in the sense that it makes me think about giving new meaning to why we're recording. And is it about what is the reason to capture the moment, and is that related to the politics today or not? It's a really interesting question. But thank you. But the more we record, the greater the diminishment of our capacity to really arrest that recording and to remember it in any meaningful way. I mean, there are ways to manage. Obviously there are a number of, Mozarov would say, solutionism apps to manage what you record. And I know there's having 2 young children and recording everything you do all the time endlessly. I used to think it was really boring when you went to an academic conference and people talk about their children, and I do it all the time. And there are a number of ways of recording. So there's an app called LifePay, for instance, that we use just so that we can manage what we record, and so that people we want access to that. People, just members of our family, our parents mainly, can access that. So it's a way of us putting the information, putting those images in one place, but making it accessible to others. So there are ways of managing that, but it still doesn't take away from the fact that 80% of those recording these images just will be deleted or sit there without even looking at them again. So very interesting to ask them what is going on. Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. So I am wondering more about the digital, the relationship between digital and collective memory. So I understand that your focus is on more how self experimented and how the constant recording is experienced in today's world. But there is also the other side of digital archive, and there are like particular movements led by librarians, to digitize, for instance, governmental data and make it accessible to all of those people who are interested. Or there are also these like oral history work where they record people's like individual and hence social memories. I mean, there are also studies like mass observation labs, and like they're also digital. So when we speak about digital memory, I think we should also make, if there is a theory, then it needs to speak to the other side of it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was wondering what...
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I guess, is there such a thing as collective memory? I don't think there is. I've written about that. But that's, it's a tired argument really attacking concepts of collective memory. So, but your question is really important in terms of the ways in which organisations, be they official or amateur, have a sense of importance around about the sustaining of a particular record of the past that's important to them. I kind of worry that, especially in the massive rush to digitise everything, in terms of what will actually remain. So in terms of, absolutely, community work, people, organisations and government trying to secure records of the future is absolutely vital. But what you find is that in most memory organisations, there's a really, in many memory organisations that I've studied, there's a really kind of patchy record of an ability to invest in the future protection and preservation of that which is being recorded. So let me give you an example. I spent 2 years doing an archive and ethnography of Army Historical Branch. And the Army Historical Branch part of the Ministry of Defence, and they are responsible for recording and storing and managing all the official records of the British Army. So this is really important historical stuff. For the past 100 years, the British Army, what comes from the front line, gets sent back to the Ministry of Defence, and up until about 2003, it was all in paper form. 2003 onwards, of course, they started getting digital stuff, and then things get very interesting. And I argue that kind of digital transformation has not led to a greater, more accurate and accessible preservation of digital records. It's actually gone the other way for a number of reasons. And I use that as an example of other departments and institutions and governments as well. So let me just say very briefly, to start, you have to invest a great deal in terms of managing that change from paper to digital if you're an organisation that's traditionally handled paper records. And of course, government and most other organisations, often the record keepers, archivists, are low to the food chain, so they just don't do that. The problem with the digital record, of course, is unless you organise in a very particular way, it makes it completely unuseful and inaccessible in the future. So what we have, what Army Historical Branch were faced with, digital records, paperback, and what would happen in the British government, these records would come back, and then after about 15 to 20 to 30 years, they come up for assessment to go into the public record, namely the National Archives. Okay, so the sensitive reviewers will look at these records and say, is this sensitive? If it is, we're not going to put it in the national records. But is it of historical value? Not sensitive, we'll put it in the national records. And these 8 or 9 historians. With the digital records, you no longer have records in the same form whatsoever. And what Army Historical Branch do, they have a belief in the total record. They archive as much as they want. They want from the front line everything to be sent. So they are sending it. And the digital stuff that's now in their archive is a huge, massive data dump of PowerPoints and images and emails and pornography. The individual and the collective is completely mixed up. The professional and the personal is completely mixed up. And out of this archive, this official archive, what will come out into the National Archives of that? I think very little, because it's very, very difficult to think about how anyone, even using some amazing software which doesn't exist, can disaggregate what is sensitive and what is not, and what should go in the public domain and what is not. So I see digital memory, to answer your questions, the collective record is really, collective memory, if you want to call it, is under extreme threat in a way that it might not have been if we hadn't moved to a digital age. So, government, in my personal view, are just not investing in they just don't see it as a really significant part of what they should be doing. So there's a real threat there. So I've written about, we're losing the history of warfare, simply as that. So absolutely we're losing the collective memory of warfare. Absolutely, it's the digital. So I absolutely extend my argument that I've made today around the threats to the individual, the fragmentation of individual memory, to a threat to collective or cultural memory, or the memory of the multitude.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have some thoughts about mechanism. Many say that the process of transforming memory now is connected with mixing up the private and public.
Yeah.
So the main motivation of trying to listen everything by a mobile phone or GoPro or something like this is first to prevent the decay of this memory of this moment, and second that they want to share it with the future, with ours. So this memory becomes not ours for everyone. So this the mixing of collective and individual memory process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Many people have written about this collapse of the private and the public, and that's come back to my example I was just making about the archives that Army Historical Branch have got, because the British Army send them, because the way digital information is used, in the sense that we routinely move from the personal to the public, the collective and the individual through our digital communications. That the record of those communications is also completely mixed up. So how on earth do we begin to disaggregate that or make sense of that? And in a purely technological challenge, as I've seen in the archives in the Ministry of Defence, there's how on earth are what was once 8 or 9 sensitivity reviewers reviewing this information, going to look through these millions and millions and millions of records and disaggregate what is personal and should remain personal, like what emails have been sent between different soldiers, or the pornography they've used, or whatever, compared with the official record that has that is valid to go into the public domain, that should go into national records to preserve a sense of why the British Army acted in a particular way at a particular time that is of historical value to the nation, the National Archives. So yeah, absolutely, it's that meshing up of the individual and personal has all kinds of consequences, as I've said, for what will be available and discernible as a form of memory in the future, as to compared with a pre-digital.
Right, so we don't have much time, so maybe we take one last question and then we move on to the next panel. Are there any more questions? All right, Andrew is here with us throughout the day, if I'm not wrong, so yeah, we can talk to him individually later.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, for the wonderful presentation. So maybe we take 5 minutes of break if someone needs to use the toilet and get some drinks, and then we come back when we start the next part. Will you speak from here, or do you need to use the slides?
I will need to use the slide, but I have this clicker.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
You can use that.
Is that okay?
Yeah, well, sorry.
Yeah, but you're going to go there first, right? Yeah. This is the one with the team is Emily who's going to share the session.
This is one. But I'm not sure if it means. Do you have any other format?
I'm going to have to give her some paper and pen because she wrote her notes. Anything else?
No, I just need to speak to Emily and
Yes, we work on the same project just because she's Loughborough. She's a musician, she's an expert in Sri Lanka. Stavros, based in
Yeah, no, I remember your name from, because I used to coordinate those relationships. So, I get all the reports and your name, was on the list. No, I'm the chair. Students to
No, she was with them. I don't know.
we have a quite integration of what we give and we do that strand. This year, there's a particular consideration this year because we gave them a little budget.
Somehow it's also very similar. Social disengaging. It's where are the boundaries between individual and political? In terms of cognition and self-perception, we have experiencing also exploring some so some questions are if this is not of psychology.
Yeah, because we're using words such as lipidinol,
from the second house. Politically, also trying to avoid psychological reduction.
Can I just have a program? Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Emily Keatley. I'm from Loughborough's Midland campus, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this session, which is Moving, Belonging, Migrating Identities on Screen. See, I've got some help. Maybe I can't manage the time. Okay, so it's a great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Juno Sud. So Juno is a third-year PhD student in the History Department at UCL, and she's going to be talking today on her paper, The Second World War and a New China on Screen.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Juno. So this presentation will analyze Hollywood films with Chinese settings and explore them in relation to the historical and political context of the period when they were produced. So firstly, I'll give you a very brief introduction of the historical context. In 1868, Berlin Game Treaty was introduced to encourage Chinese to go to the States to work and study. And the result of the treaty was, when the 1870s economic recession began, the number of Chinese laborers peaked, which made the employment market even more competitive for the white workers. So some very important labor parties back in the day therefore began to protest the Chinese on the West Coast with slogans like, the Chinese must go. And this economic factor has been stressed the most as the reasons for the huge anti-Chinese sentiment formed in the late 19th century. Since 1882, a series of Chinese exclusion acts was introduced to reject immigration from China. So here you can see a set of quite double standards policies toward China and Chinese people. Internationally, it requested China to open door with the so-called open door policy, but domestically, it closed its own door to the Chinese people with a series of Chinese exclusion acts. The new film industry began to develop in the US in 1900, and finding a balancing point between the prejudice toward the Chinese people and the yearning for China as a market full of potential became a tricky task for Hollywood to work out in the following decades. So I had to be honest, it was firstly, when I first realized that, it was surprising to me when I first realized that the very early representations of China and Chinese people was more sympathetic than actually hateful. For example, a idealized Chinese man, Chen Huan in Broken Blossoms, and his tragic love story with this British girl called Lucy. The Chinese laundryman Yan Xing in Shadows, and he is the kindest figure in the entire film, but still excluded from the white community even after his conversion to Christianity. And Lotus Flower in The Toll of the Sea in 1922, and the name Lotus Flower later became a stereotype in describing the kind of Chinese woman who are beautiful but fragile and always ready to sacrifice herself and her people for her white partner. There are, of course, some negative representations of Chinese people. For example, the evil Manchurian father in The Forbidden City in 1918 and Mr. Wu in the film with the same title in 1927. However, the feature films about China really began to thrive, to increase in number, was during the Great Depression era. There were several things happening simultaneously in the period that might be contributing to Hollywood's awakening recognition of China as a workable theme. First of all, Hollywood began to feel the pinch of the great economic downturn in the beginning of 1930s. It did not happen right after the Wall Street crash in 1929, because the coming of sound in 1927 was still considered a novelty in the last couple of years of 1920s. When the studios felt the growing financial pressure, they became extra creative and sensitive about basically any theme that had a potential in a box office. For example, the genres like musicals, screwball comedies, and gangster films, the so-called escapist films, and exciting, exotic stories like Adventures in the Far East were all taken into more consideration and made into production. An example is Frank Capra's famous escapist film called Lost Horizon in 1937. Second of all, since the late 1920s, Hollywood films were used to stimulate consumptions of American commodities and acceptance of American way of life in other countries. So these pictures were all covers of British fan magazines, and they encouraged their readers to go to new films, to purchase film-related products. They applied similar strategies in Latin American countries and was very successful there. So they wanted to do the same in China. This was what the director of BFDC said when asked about whether films can enhance commercial relationship with China. Okay. So third of all, Japan's invasion of China was well publicized in newspaper in the early 1930s. It must not be difficult for Hollywood to realize the people's growing interest in the Sino-Japanese affairs. Since the information sources were very limited back in the day, the films could be utilized to fulfill people's curiosities in the other part of the world. and this will is a big promise for the financial returns. Evidence for this can be found in a series of films produced after 1932 set against a war-ravaged China, which made it felt very current to the 1930s audience. Some other factors also influence the portrayals of China and its people, includes the enforcement of the production code in 1934 and a correspondence between the PCA and a Chinese consul sent to LA by the Chinese nationalist government. But it needs to be pointed out here that although there were more films about China in the early 1930s, most of them were very negative and racist about the Chinese. The stories were usually told from a condescending perspective, seeing Chinese as this barbaric, uncivilized heathen characters, very similar to the early views of the missionaries in China. Here's an excerpt from The Bitter Tea of General Yan.
I was telling the story of a crucifixion to some Mongolian tribesmen. Finally, I thought I had touched their hearts. They crept closer to my little platform, their eyes burning with the wonder of their attention. Mongolian bandits, mind you, listening spellbound. But alas, I had misinterpreted their interest in the story. The next caravan of merchants that crossed the Gobi Desert was captured by them and crucified. That, my friends, is China.
Yeah, so this film actually lost money, mainly because it was banned in Great Britain and British Commonwealth countries because it centers on the romantic relationship between a Chinese warlord and a white missionary. Entering the late 1930s, the stereotypical image of China came to seem increasingly inappropriate to the federal government and its propagandists. The image of China and Chinese then changed drastically as a requirement of the Roosevelt administration during the wartime. There were two agencies that had particular influences on wartime image of China. They are OWI and UCR. When the Second World War broke out in Europe in September 1939, the U.S. did not have a formal propaganda agency. Slowly, however, Roosevelt believed the necessity of launching a propaganda strategy directed toward building up preparedness on the home front. Shortly after the U.S. declaration of a war against Japan, Roosevelt appointed Lowell Mellett as the coordinator of government films. This decision indicated that the American government had now begun to use film as a strategic tool for propaganda purposes. In June 1942, Roosevelt merged several propaganda agencies with overlapping functions and created the Office of War Information. The creation of OWI represented the federal government's determination to mobilize the mass media behind war effort. OWI had a huge impact on the representations of the United allies and enemies during the Second World War. On a non-governmental level, however, in 1941, 8 humanitarian agencies with different concerns consolidated their operations under United China Relief, the UCR. This organization launched many campaigns to raise money and educate Americans about their Chinese allies. UCR had many influential people on board, for example, Pearl S. Buck, David O. Selznick, and John D. Rockefeller. UCR also produced several films for their campaign, including China First to Fight in 1943 and Here is China in 1944. According to these films, the U.S.-China relationship was heading toward a bright future, and the Chinese were active fighters in the war. Those propaganda films produced by Hollywood and supervised by OWI adopted a very similar approach. So now I'll show you a clip from a wartime propaganda film called China.
Please wait a moment and let me finish. These girls are students. They're just a few out of many thousands. They're being trained for a very special job. To educate millions of Chinese, to teach them how working together they can build a new China. Mr. Jones, you and I are Americans. Our forefathers fought and died for a new America. These people are fighting for a new China. And if we don't help them now, well, I, for one, am going to stop calling myself an American.
Yeah. Well, OWI was satisfied with the film for, firstly, it showed the fallacy of thinking that America can remain neutral. And secondly, the portrayal of Chinese was not merely as Americans' followers or servants, but as intelligent freedom fighters who know what needs to be done to save their own country. The Chinese characters in these films were mainly played by young Chinese-American performers, which were quite rare in the early films because majority of them were played by Caucasian actors with the yellow face makeup on. However, in this film, the youngsters are educated and endowed with Western knowledge, and they understand American culture. There's a very blurred line between these Chinese young people and Americans themselves, especially when the female protagonist compares the youngsters with the American predecessors during the American Revolution. OWI was very satisfied because it showed a new China moving toward American values. Another film that satisfied OWI was Dragon Seed from 1944. This film expanded yet further the idea of a new China as a country with the political awareness almost reached that of the United States. The film tells a story about a modern Chinese woman, Jade, played by Katharine Hepburn, who leads the inhabitant of her village to join the guerrillas and fight against Japanese troops. MGM even hired a technical advisor called Xu Wei to clarify several misunderstandings the American had about Chinese on behalf of the studio. Xu clarified that Chinese people do not have slant eyes. Many Chinese, including General Jiang Jieshi, have large eyes, similar to the Occidentals. He also insisted that Chinese woman's skin is milk white in color. Statements of this kind demonstrate how eager the film producers were to liken Chinese to Americans, both physically and in matter of behavior. This attempt to Americanize Chinese in films can be seen as a positive step, a step forward at some level, because it did reject stereotypes of Chinese as being deceitful and corrupt in many of the warlord films in the previous decade. However, this message was simply suggested by making the Chinese look and behave whiter and emphasizing that Chinese culture was moving toward American culture, a strategy that actually revealed persistence of the assumptions of white superiority. In Americanizing the Chinese, US government also tried its very best to distinguish Japanese from the Chinese. The word Japs and Nips flooded into wartime articles or film reviews dealing with the battles in the Pacific region. A wartime pamphlet elaborated in detail about comparisons of the physical differences between the Chinese and the Japanese. It seemed to both to American propagandists and Hollywood filmmakers that they had to make the Chinese look whiter to underline the point that they were good. And the emphasis of Asianness of Japanese was done deliberately to make them to appear indubitably bad, which ironically was reinforcement of racial discrimination. In the 1945 film China Sky, RKO casted Mexican-American actor Anthony Quinn as a Chinese guerrilla leader, and the Japanese villain in the very same film, however, was played by a Chinese-American actor, Richard Liu. In fact, Liu had played many evil Japanese generals during the wartime. For these kind of casting choices, the studio had the most legitimate excuse, the internment of Japanese Americans. 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which removed all people of Japanese descent from the Pacific Coast military zone. Therefore, the studios did not have enough Japanese performers to play Japanese roles. But the truth is, even when the studios did have enough Asian performers, they still casted Chinese actors as villain while using Occidental performers to play the roles of upright Chinese characters. The studio's casting choice implied that a Japanese soldier played by an Asian performer makes more sense to send a convincing message that he's villainous, while Chinese hero or heroine, if played by the real Chinese performers, would be more difficult for American audience to sympathize with. An incorrect notion that people's personalities are determined almost entirely by their racial heritage. So my conclusion for this is, even though many favorable Chinese characters were introduced by Hollywood on screen during the Second World War, they reflected Americans' wishful thinking rather than the reality on the ground or things the studios or the government truly believed about China and its people. In the reality, U.S. government was far from happy with the Chinese nationalist government and its distribution of U.S. aid during the war. The nationalists held their fire on the battleground with Japan because they want to save it for fighting the communists. This inactiveness in the battlefield of the nationalist army and the federal government's dissatisfaction toward them, however, can never be found in any of the propaganda films. These positive films portrayed of Chinese were produced merely to fulfill the political needs during wartime, and there was an immediate change right after 1949, the founding of People's Republic of China by the Chinese Communist Party led by Chairman Mao. So, thank you.
Okay. So, our next speaker is Emma Tarashenko. Emma, hi. Emma's going to be talking to us about the representation of illegal migrants' worldview and empathy through films, particularly looking at the film My Little One, I think. Yeah? Okay, over to you. You've got 20 minutes. So, have you got a presentation? Okay, so is it on there? Okay. I'll let you know. We've got 10 minutes and 5. Okay, on the back.
Good morning, everyone. I will talk about the representation of illegal migrants' worldview and empathy for film on the material of My Little One. So, first of all, I need a little bit introduction on the problematic. But nowadays, in according to official statistics, there are about 500,000 of migrants in Moscow, and in unofficial statistics there is no clear data. So the status of these people remains problematic, and according to Georgia Gabon's theory that he presents in his series, Homo Sacer series, we may call this problematic status vita nuda or a nude life. What does it mean? That means that the migrants have no opportunity to be the persons or have some emotions, value, and something like that, and become the only life cells. So they falls into such position that there is no any rights. And in our everyday discourse, this topic, the topic of migrants' emotions or their feelings, lies in the area of silence. And if we're talking about representation, cultural representation, such as in films, we may find out, first of all, that these representations are really rare, and the second, that most of them are indirect. So the second point is means that figures and images of migrants constructed not by themselves. So their own stories are told by someone else. So the strategy legitimize their feelings, their emotions, and they can't speak for their own. And the strategy is just paralysis, just a field of silence of this problem. So about indirect representation, they may say that it's rightly to talk about it in relation to very good films, very strong. For example, the brand new film that is interpreted to show the migrant's life is Fire to See, but the whole image here constructed from a position of non-migrant and through his eyes. And I insist that there's opportunity to the third alternative strategy to represent migrants is, and I suggest to turn to the Mikhail Bakhtin's theory and the concept of outsideness. That concept means, first of all, there are some intentional feeling to other which is not completely identify one to another and create some field or opportunity to understand the other person. So empathy constructed there like an emotions, and then may be recognized in some consciousness level. And the film that will follow such strategy in representation in representing migrants will represent the subjective and personal position of these humans, like the human first of all. And another way to this correlates this concept of outsiders is the embodying. So the main thing that camera will concentrate is the body, and it will create somatic reactions that will give us opportunity to construct empathy for film. So I think the analyzed film, My Little One, is works in this specific in this area, and I need to say about several words about film itself. So the film called My Little One, its other title is Aika, by the name of the main heroine, and it was created and realized in 2018 by Sergei Bertsoy. And the main plot is concentrates of the Aika, the young woman, the short period of her life, and she's illegal migrant in Moscow. And the main specifics of film are that it is represented the Aika's point of view. So its film constructs her world directly. So I investigate the strategies of this representing, how it will be works, and what can it give to us. The first instrument of representation of the strategy of representation is the camera angle, camera instantly camera instantly follows a heroine throughout the film. So in the start point, they find out the maternity house and the heroine, and know nothing about her. And during the film, they follows her and see any emotion, and everything really close. So the portrait angle prevails throughout the film, and sometimes it looks like a coning, so you can see it's on the slide. And so this following of camera is like invisible invention of heroine's life, and following her everywhere, and see and have an opportunity to see the places with connected to the paralleled migrants' life that we have no opportunity to see in our life itself, for our normal life. And next thing that's connected to this portrait angle is the specific of representing memory. They must say that memories are really significant for constructing self-identity, and thus to understand how migrants' worlds constructed will must to turn out to the migrants' memories and how they are represented in the films. So the main concept here is connected to the camera angle, that instantly follows heroine by this camera, and have really few flashbacks, and these flashbacks are like telling stories. They have no long stories from the past which are included in the diagesis, but the stories which we hear is telling by Aika by herself. And this constructed the specific space that here no past itself, but the total present. This total present is not reflected by heroine or by spectators, by viewers, and this space of life is just swallowing. And the own identity the next point of constructing the image of Aika and image of migrants at all is the concept of alienation that's created by light and color. So first of all, that's throughout the film we see the very high contrast between the heroine and surroundings. So she is shown in some dark colors, and the space of Moscow is shown by streets full of snows, very bright, and so this is a high contrast on an emotional level that creates the fields of alienation between the main heroine and the surroundings. And let me say that Aika is alien not from surrounding soul, but for every people, and she constructed like the okay. I have 10 minutes or yeah. I have a lot of time, so and as I said, she's shown in dark colors opposite to the bright surroundings. So the only person which I found her identity is her child, also in the film. So conclusion. So and first of all, that I trying to say that this film correlates with this third strategy to represent migrants as a human, and which construct in a field of embodying and empathy. And the specific of representing the total now, total present, correlates with the Vita status. So I must say that Aika has her own memories, but she must hide them to follow this field of present, total present, and to survive. And the really and the thing that we must point it out that this position of view creates the field of outsideness, and they may see the world through the migrant sites, so it helps to create the field of empathy and intentional feeling to other. So this is all. Thank you for attention.
Okay, thank you. So our last speaker, Yasin Aydınlık. Hi. Yasin is a research assistant at the Faculty of Communication at Marmara University in Istanbul. And he's going to be talking to us today about moving history, floating identity, displacement, memory, and the mind politics in national Salgu's journey to the sun and waiting for the clouds. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. As my very long title suggests, my talk is about how displacements, forced migrations in the history of Turkey are remembered in Turkish cinema of the last 20 or 25 years, which we name it as New Turkish Cinema. I chose two films from the prominent Turkish director, Yeşim Ustaoğlu, and I will try to explore how these films invite us to think about Turkish national identity through these remembrances. And also I will talk about how these films can be considered within Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's idea of the minor. In fact, this is a part of a working paper on how Ustaoğlu's cinema in general deals with migration, memory, and minor politics. And as I'll try to explain in a minute, Journey to the Sun and Waiting for the Clouds, I believe, are two of the best examples of a minor cinema in Turkey. So let's start with some background. Osman Suner, one of the prominent Turkish film scholars, describes the cinema of Turkey emerged in the mid-1990s as a haunted house. Haunted because the past traumatic experiences engraved in the collective memory of Turkish society haunt the narratives of the cinema. Denial of ethnic and religious identities, terror of military coups, guilt of bloody conflicts, etc. Yet the word haunted has somewhat a double meaning in Turkish. It not only refers to being haunted by ghosts, but also has a relation with dreams, imaginations, and most importantly, fantasies. So, on the one hand, we have popular or mainstream or commercial cinema as a fantasy, depicting an idealized national past never existed, collective childhood nostalgia free from guilt, or a harmonious and homogeneous society without conflicts. And on the other, political or so-called art house films try to face these traumas, try to depict tensions around the questions of identity and belonging, and representing various ethnic, religious, and sexual identities is very fundamental in new political films of Turkey. And this brings us to Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the minor. Although they do not use the term minor cinema in their works, Deleuze adopts the three characteristics of a minor literature to modern political cinema, which is actually an effective minor cinema. Firstly, unlike classical cinemas like Hollywood, minor cinema does not presuppose a people. Instead, it aims to create a sense of a people yet to come. Secondly, whereas the line between political and private spaces are drawn clearly in classical cinemas, it disappears in minor cinema, and all the private affairs of the characters are politicized. And lastly, it has a collective value. It resists creating cliches about the people, like in classical cinemas, or recreating them, as in the case of oppositional cinemas. Instead, it aims to start a never-ending dialogue, a never-ending transformation. In this way, minor cinema, in a Deleuzian sense, deterritorialize the major narratives, destabilize the standard conventions. And I think that's why Deleuze finds minor cinema more powerful than an oppositional cinema. So what about new political films of Turkey dealing with all these identity issues? Can we call these films as a minor cinema? In fact, it's difficult to say so. Turkish political cinema from the 1990s onwards is more like an oppositional than a minor cinema. It re-territorializes the major narrative, which is the official state discourse. So basically, it aims at transformation, yes, but simply by opposing the major voice, by fighting with it, not by creating a dialogue, by trying to transform it from within. To put it simply, a mainstream film may depict a Kurdish protagonist according to the state discourse. A Kurdish villager, for example, cannot even speak in Kurdish in the films of 1990s, or can only sing a folk song in Kurdish in the films of the 2000s and first half of the 2000s. In a typical political film, on the other hand, we can easily identify Turkish or Kurdish characters, because Turks are generally represented as state officials, soldiers, judges, sometimes teachers, denying the Kurdish identity, of course, and Kurds are the oppressed ones, with exposing to state violence. It's something like the representations of popular cinema are reversed. That is, while the popular cinema territorializes, draws the boundaries, the political cinema re-territorializes, redraws the boundaries of a national identity or a national discourse. But at the end, all of these films, whether it's popular or political, create their own cliches. However, a couple of films like Journey to the Sun and Waiting for the Clouds try to deterritorialize the standard conventions, try to erase these boundaries that I mentioned on national identity. Journey to the Sun tells the story of Mehmet, an urban migrant from Tire, an Aegean town of Turkey. Waiting for the Clouds, on the other hand, tells the story of Ayşe, an elderly woman living in a village located in the Black Sea region of Turkey. Not coincidentally, Mehmet and Ayşe are the most typical Turkish male and female names, and both the Aegean and Black Sea regions are the highly Turkish populated and probably the most nationalist regions of Turkey. So, Ustaoğlu seems to assure us at first that both films are the stories of their very Turkish protagonists. However, as the films move on, she intentionally creates ambiguities about how to identify these protagonists, and all these processes is highly related with memories and remembrances. For example, because of his dark skin, Mehmet is always confused with an Easterner, which is another way of calling him Kurdish. Even his girlfriend Arzu, a German Turk who is migrated back to Turkey, tells him that he is too black for being from Tire. And when Mehmet becomes friends with Berzan, the real Kurdish protagonist of the film, who was holding a television on the previous slide, Berzan also cannot believe Mehmet is a Turk. Berzan, on the other hand, is one of more than 1 million Kurdish citizens displaced from their villages throughout the 1990s. He is a political character, often goes to demonstrations, sometimes gets arrested, and in the middle of the film is murdered by the police. Mehmet is also taken to the police station after a misunderstanding, and he immediately becomes a usual suspect. He looks like a Kurd, and they find a Kurdish music cassette in his pocket that Berzan has given him. So, according to the police, all these evidences indicate that Mehmet is a member of a Kurdish political organization. Then they take him into custody, interrogate him, and torture him. Suddenly, the border between the political and the private spaces of Mehmet's life disappears, and he involuntarily becomes a political character. That's why he loses his job. His girlfriend's parents do not allow their daughter to see him again. That's why he receives death threats by his housemates. It seems that Mehmet has not been accepted as a regular Turk. So, by this way, the film actually does not discuss being a Kurd, but rather it discusses being positioned as a Kurd in the 1990s of Turkey. When Mehmet learns his friend's death, Berzan's death, he decides to take Berzan's body to his southeastern village. Mehmet's journey in the Kurdish region is like a little history of the Kurdish question of Turkey. Families migrating to Istanbul, children secretly trying to take Kurdish newspapers into the cities, villages having been evacuated, sometimes by being burned, soldiers in every corner of the cities, and Ustaoğlu uses real archival footage of the soldiers in that scene. It seems that Ustaoğlu tries to construct a collective memory of the 1990s, of Turkey's Kurdish question, through Mehmet's eyes. In Waiting for the Clouds, on the other hand, Ustaoğlu this time prefers using recorded memories and starts her film with the archival footage from the exile of the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. This was a part of the Turkification process of Anatolia during the war and an ethnic cleansing, and resulted in the death of tens of thousands of Greek subjects of the Ottoman Empire. So with this prologue, the film gives us a clue about Ayşe's backstory. Unlike Mehmet, Ayşe looks like a regular Muslim Turkish villager in her traditional clothes. But in fact, she is one of the Greek children saved and raised by a Turkish villager during the exile. Her real name is Eleni, and she hides her true identity for 50 years, as well as the only photograph left from her true family. The death of her elder stepsister at the very beginning of the film triggers Aisha's memories about the exile. Her stepsister was the only family member Aisha had, and moreover, she was the only one who witnessed Eleni's tragedy. But now, Aisha is all alone with her memories. So she falls into silence, alienates herself from the villagers, and starts repeating the name of her lost brother, Nico. We listen Eleni speaking in Greek and telling in details her story of how she survived, how she lost her family, found by a Turkish villager, and then lost her brother. When she learns that her brother is alive, she leaves the village to go to Greece. Yet when she finds him, Nico does not remember her. In the last scene of the film, Nico puts old photographs of himself on the table, explaining that if Eleni is his sister, she must have been at least in one of the photographs. But she isn't. Ustad seems to show us how such a traumatic experience, like the exile, damages the memories of its victims, and Nico needs to restore his memories about his sister. But how? So, in conclusion, Journey to the Sun ends when Mehmet arrives at Berzan's village, Zorduç, which is completely destroyed and inundated. Mehmet's journey to that village, which is in reality now only in the memories of its former inhabitants, becomes a real archival footage of that real Kurdish village that does not exist anymore. So Mehmet becomes a part of that collective memory. Waiting for the Clouds, on the other hand, ends with Eleni showing Nico the only family photograph she has as the only evidence of their relationship. And this time, a real archival material, the photograph, connects the tragedy of Eleni and Nico with all the people we saw at the very beginning of the film in the archival footage of the exile. At the ends of their journeys, both Mehmet and Ayşe go beyond the standard conventions of popular or political cinemas of Turkey. In one of the last scenes, Mehmet introduces himself to a soldier as being from Zorduç, Berzan's village. And he says once he knew a man named Mehmet from Tire. So Mehmet/Berzan, is not a regular Turk anymore. But is he a Kurd now? Or Ayşe/Eleni suddenly becomes a Greek after all those 50 years? Or is it possible for her to return to her Turkishness? In fact, these are not the questions Yeşim Ustaoğlu seeks to answer. And minor cinema does not try to answer as well. Journey to the Sun and Waiting for the Clouds rather start a dialogue on the fragility of a national identity and the impossibility of fixing it. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers. Let's invite all the speakers to come and take a seat at the front. We'll just come and grab a chair and then we can take questions together. And thank you everyone for your impeccable timekeeping as well. So, can I throw the floor open to questions?
Well, thank you all for the interesting presentations. I would like to make a question to Yasin. It's specifically about the concept of minor politics that you translate as minor cinema. The idea of opposition you work on, don't you think that it already contains the idea of transformation also? Because you put both concepts as opposites, and I see that they are interconnected.
In a typical political film, for example, Mehmet and Berzan should go for a journey together and try to know each other, or at the end kill each other, or something like that. They negotiate, or they go from the different directions, and this is, I think, fixing the positions. I mean, there are a lot of examples, political examples in Turkish political cinema, especially in the on the Kurdish question. A soldier and guerrilla involuntarily becomes starts a journey and forced to force their character to know each other, but at the end they don't want to be together. I mean, because their positions are so fixed and stable so they don't it's not open to any transformation. But in a minor example, like these films, they transform. They go beyond the Turkish national identity or Kurdish national ethnic identity. I don't know. So I think it's more. I'm not saying that the political oppositional film does not have any transformative power, but if there is a hope of real transformation, it's in the minor examples.
Thank you. Davina, I have a question for the first presenter. I was wondering whether the fact that there was an involvement of migrants in the production of these films that you were describing brought any kind of difference to the power dynamics that was at play, because the story that you told showed us very clearly, obviously, the links between the changing political context in the US and the kinds of images that were being produced. And I appreciate you're working with archival sources that perhaps don't represent the views of the actors themselves, but I was wondering, do you think that there is evidence of any kind of, maybe even resistance from second, first generation Chinese migrants to taking up and being cast in particular ways, in very problematic ways, as you showed?
Yeah, there were actually works, but not so much in the very early representations, early film industry, because their voice are very, very little. And as you can see, the real Chinese American or Chinese first generation immigration, they cannot really get any important roles in the film. Minor roles, yes, but not. So even actors on the screen actors, they cannot get big roles. What about the screenwriters or directors? There's just no voice. But interestingly, there were a lot of government efforts. I slightly mentioned about the correspondence between the PCA and the Chinese consul, and he was sent, actually there were two of them, sent in the early 30s by the Chinese nationalist government. And you can see a lot of archive materials in Margaret Herrick Library in LA. It was fascinating that when they produced some films about critiquing about China or like unfair about China, this man would write to the PCA saying, hey, this is not fair and this is wrong and blah, blah, blah. It was very interesting. You can see he really tried his best to make his voice heard from a governmental level, but really within the film industry or the society, there were evidence about there were protests, saying things you can't present Chinese in this very negative and racist way, but it's overlooked. Yeah.
An important part of the story, to show this kind of resistance and perhaps in an effort to think beyond kind of the national boxes when you think about history and presentations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I also have a question for the first speaker, and I like your friend, thank you very much. And on the presentation, I saw a picture that depicting Chinese man with a white wife, and they love each other. And as far as I know, in the turn of the century, like the second half of the 19th and there's an anti-miscegenation law in America, and this picture just I think it's very contradictory to this very culture and the emotion in U.S. that is anti the Chinese migration. So what do you think this picture, such depiction would have the implication for our understanding of?
Yeah, great question. The film, I believe you were talking about the 1919 one, The Broken Blossom, where there's a Chinese man and a white girl lying on the bed, the one you were referring to. So that's 1919, and the introduction of a production code which contains the anti-miscegenation law was introduced in 1930. So it was before that, and there were per code, and the enforcement of the code was in 1954. So really before that, you can find some very bold representation of miscegenation on the screen. But the thing is, so that film was it's very special, significant because it was directed by D.W. Griffith. If you know him, he's a racist director, and he made this film about the birth of a nation in 1915, discriminating against African American, and was hugely protested against him, saying he's a racist and stuff. And my personal belief is he made that film, 1919, the Broken Blossom one, to deliberately saying, I'm not racist. See, I showed this beautiful love between a Chinese man and a white woman. So that's a random one. The majority, the society was very racist, and they cannot really accept the miscegenation between a Chinese man and a white woman. And recently, I've read this very interesting discussion by a film historian Gina Marchetti, and she talked about this famous captivity narratives in Hollywood films, saying that the white woman, the abduction of white women by other races will always pose the greatest anxiety in white patriarchal society, because these women cannot be trusted anymore. There were possibility for this woman to reproduce with and nurture an enemy, but on the contrary, white man's exogamous relationship between a white man and alien woman was excused because that means demoralization of the integrity of other races. So I found it interesting because that's a perfect explanation for the representations of Chinese men, women in Hollywood films. When you see, no matter as lotus flowers or dragon lady, the femme fatale kind of Chinese women were always sexualized and sometimes hypersexualized, while the Chinese men were always emasculated and desexualized. And it was not only in early presentations, there were also, like in the 70s, the Bruce Lee, the Kung Fu master, even though he's physically powerful, he's monkish, abstinence, this kind of figure. And there was a film called Romeo Must Die by Jet Li in 2000 with Aaliyah. And the ending scene was this Chinese man kissing the American woman, but they changed it to a hug because they say the audience cannot accept to see a Chinese man kissing an American woman. So you can see it's 2000, and still you can see lots of persistence of this kind of desexualization of Chinese men in Pacific Rim, in Transformers. So yeah, I do believe there are different portrayals of on sexuality of both genders. Thank you. Any final questions?
Thank you all for your presentations. I'm sorry to harp on this more, but I have a question for Juno. Kind of going off of that and something else that you said in the presentation about the studios gearing their kind of sentimentality towards the audience by having a white hero portraying the Asian character. Do you think that these are kind of precautionary anticipations of the studios, or is there actual reflection in reviews from audiences that they preferred this kind of portrayal?
Well, it's more like mutual reinforcement. So the bitter tea of General Yan was actually a white man playing a Chinese man, and even that was unacceptable. But it was possible to made into production was because both protagonists were actually white people. So when you watch it, the story was telling you the love story was between a Chinese man and a white woman, but the audience know it was a white man and a white woman. And so things like this and social prejudice, that was an important thing, because in the early the late 19th century and early 20th century, the residents in California were actually from the South, so social prejudice was an important thing. And also the economic factors were also thing. There was a huge anti-Chinese sentiment like that, and the anti-miscegenation law, as you see. So it's really like it reinforce each other. Like the studios don't produce such thing, and then they don't accept such thing. So for my understanding, it was more like this.
Any further questions? If it's okay, I have a question for all three speakers, actually, just following up on something that Sabina said about national boxes and the idea of the nation. It seems to me that in memory studies in general, there's been a move away from kind of methodological nationalism into something that we all know. There's been lots of different theoretical approaches to moving beyond the nation. And this conference is all about mobile forms of remembering it in different ways. And I just wondered if you could reflect on the analytical value of the nation and nationalism for your different pieces of research, because it seemed to me that it was being implied and used in different ways. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that. Anyone who wants to start? Go ahead.
Well, there are two parts on my research. One is the nationalism of the United States. Another one is about China. Well, about China was always a fantasy. It varies in Hollywood films during different periods of time, as I already said in my presentation. And in the U.S., it's very peculiar period of the Second World War, because that's the strongest, the governments, the film industry, all of the media industries were trying to construct this strong nationalism, in this special time. And so that's the thing. And another thing is, Hollywood as the American film industry as a whole, it didn't want too much of government intervention. And the foundation of the Production Code Administration was actually, MPDA was actually aimed to do that, because it's a self-regulatory bodies. We have a set of self-regulations, then the government won't intervene too much. That's why the Second World War period was that special, because that's pretty much the only period when the government intervened with the film industry. And another time was during Cold War McCarthyism, the HUAC's investigations of the film industry. So yeah, I think it's definitely a great question, and I'm not sure if I'm answering.
And about mine, research, especially trying to avoid the concentration of the nation itself, but on the status of any illegal migrants. So it's not concentrated on the nation problem as nationalist problems. And I'm trying to investigate the mechanisms to create some filter dialogue. This is reference to the Bachtian's theory of outsiders and dialogue and so on. They're creating a field of understanding, but not the opposition. And I'm trying to connect this to the field of the problematic status of migrants, which are first of all humans, and the next they're found in this problematic status in the level of rights. The Bachtian's theory appeals to the dialogue with the human, and I'm trying to find such an optics in the cultural representation. And my case of My Little One was I think one of the few number of films which can use such an optics like remembrance of the human, and they can see something through the eyes of the level and problematic status. So this reference the field of something common, but not for something opposite. So thank you.
Thank you. There's been a growing nationalism in Turkish film production or television production for 5 years. And nowadays, in television, soldiers in series, military series, focusing on the lives of military or special operation forces personnel, killing Kurdish guerrillas and their enemies in general, foreign enemies. But before that, during the second half and first second half of the 2010s and 2010, between 2010 and 2015, in a resolution process between Turkey and the Kurdish movement. And during that time, there were a lot of films focusing on the Kurdish guerrillas. I mean, Kurdish rebels was seen more like more in a humane attitude during that time. But again, before that, and for example, I remember in 2008, a film was censored in a festival in Sweden, I guess. And later, a bureaucrat from cultural ministry said that in the time of war, a Turkish woman cannot fall in love with a Kurdish man. It's an ordinary man, not a guerrilla or something. And before that, during the first half of the 2000s, during the European Union negotiations, again there was a more democratic environment, and the directors can film something like the Journey to the Sun or Waiting for the Clouds. And it's led me to my island.
Thank you. Any further questions before we break for lunch? Oh, sorry, Sabina.
Sorry. I have another one for your presentation about My Little One. So it kind of builds on what Emily was asking about, trying to think outside of the national box when you think about mediation of migration or mediation of memory and history. Now, in your case, it strikes me that what's interesting in the case is that it's a very particular kind of migration. So it is international migration, but it's international migration from near abroad. So this is a Kyrgyz woman. And the status of the near abroad in Russia today is very peculiar given the political developments and the way the Soviet Party is remembered. So, Kyrgyzstan is foreign, but it's kind of also not foreign. So I was wondering whether, you had a chance to reflect on this, and whether the fact that the director actually chose the story of a Kyrgyz woman over, perhaps, you know, a story of a migrant from anywhere else in the world is significant in this case? And what does it say about, you know, the relationship between migration, memory, and nation in your case?
Thank you. It's a really good question because I think it's really significant that this woman, Aika, is Kyrgyz migrant. First of all, in Russian everyday discourse, they have some alienation, some opposite of Progan and non-Progan. So if the migrants have a white skin and European appearance, it's okay. They're sort of like our little brothers. So this is a so problematic field because in this area falls the Belarusian migrants, the Ukrainian migrants, they're our little brothers. So this is one field. And another field, there are some the people from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and they are alien for this main discourse. So that woman, she's a Kyrgyz migrant, is really significant for the field, and that's really important in my investigation. That field of dialogue must be constructed with this area. So another thing that I have, I thought I have to read a few times, so I didn't reflect and didn't tell about the child, her child. That's important because all the diaries start in a maternity hospital, and she leaves her child, but it's really not usual for Kyrgyz women. They really take care of their child. That's really important. And she finds her identity in the end of film with this child. So it's the great line of the reflection of her identity here in Moscow, like the alien place, where she's in alien, and child. She leaves her child in the second of film. So it's a really important line too.
It's more like a comment because I want to just follow up Emily's the discussion raised by you, because regarding the relationship between nationalism and memory studies. Because I think from a Chinese perspective, the term nationalism itself do travel. We can regard this term as a transcultural memory because it's introduced from the West to actually Japan in the early 20th century, and then it reintroduced from Japan to China by Chinese international students studied in Japan. So the term itself, do travel, is not a fixed term from the Chinese perspective.
Any further questions?
A lot of your presentations focus a lot on the body as a carrier of identity, of maybe memories of the migrant experience, and that has probably certain advantages for film and certain risks as well as being talked about. Could you, maybe all three of you, or like whoever finds it interesting, to elaborate on that? So I feel like in all of your three presentations, it was a strong focus on the body and the physicality of the characters in your presentation, like on very racialized, but also in your presentation on the woman was very much the focus on her body. Maybe if you can elaborate a bit more on maybe the advantages of film to focus more on the body rather than on language maybe, or like the advantages and risks of that.
Thank you for the question. So in my presentation, I tried to So this is some conceptual frame of the embodying actions. So the body language really is a specific of a media, I think, of a cinema. That the body affects some feelings in the spectators. So these fields may be useful for investigating some fields of dialogue, that they see the body, the body language, and the Military one is really concentrates on the body of main heroine, and this aspect can make a feel of reflection and feel of identification with the heroine, and so it's really important to create the field of empathy.
Yeah, I do think in films that the visual impact was the most important thing. So that's why a lot of films emphasize on the construction of this body features, face features, and then yes, the language. Like in a lot of the early presentations of Chinese, they have strong accent, and they're not even Chinese accent. Just want to make it to emphasize on exoticness of this Oriental characters. And just a fun fact that, like the Bitter Tea of January Yan, the actor was actually Swedish, and they had to make him a slant eye with a clipping toward the head, and it's so harmful for to the actor that his eyes were injured so badly that between shots they have to kept him into a dark room, and with red goggles to protect his eyes. So we can see that the efforts were made to construct these body differences, and I found your comments very interesting about how they define who are our Latinos and who are the otherness, and was basically on the physical appearances, and that's really human natures. We define who are ourselves and who are the aliens by how you look, how you behave, and that's very interesting question.
Yeah, appearance is very important because it can distort the national audience. Think about seeing in Waiting for the Clouds when Eleni goes to Greece, with her traditional Muslim Turkish outfit, she goes to a church and sits there and listens to a choral piece. I think for the audience it's very destabilized this fixed national position. They have fixed national positions, and so it's very important, I guess, the physical appearance, the outfits.
Thank you.
Okay. I think all that remains is to thank our speakers again for their excellent papers.
Thank you so much, Emily, for coming. She's on maternity, she should not be here next week. Thank you very much. Thank you to the three speakers. Lunch is ready, and you will find where the coffee was as well, from that direction. And we will meet back here in an hour, and the room will be divided then, so you have to make a decision which of the certain two panels you want to join. Thank you so much.
Actually, I have
a kind of like a double like female catering, how do you have exotic features to be fetishized, sexualized, but at the same time Western features to
I was thinking of you as I was listening to the conversation about the case of historical interpretation and how
I decided it like I only know there were a lot of Western veterans.
Yeah, I mean, and that's this kind of historical yellow peril. I mean, some of the classic stereotypes, Chinese emperor, it's like taking from Britain, transposing.
This is the German pronunciation, German pronounced, but I think basically the whole of Eastern Europe, German is Julia, and then the rest is I don't know. You have the name in Greek as well. How do you pronounce it? Yeah, then Spain. So I guess it's always the same name anyway. It's an easy name otherwise.
It's good that you kept it in English because many people do it like English pronouncing.
No, I don't mind the other English pronounce. I don't care if I pronounce my own name. There's no way.
One, which is that one. Okay.
Which one is it?
I was thinking of Tuesday.
I think we're going to have the participants, so maybe
that's the
problem. These things happen to me all the time.
So you need to.
So you might have the person the same happen to her.
And because I'm doing it organization, I'm studying, I don't have the numbers.
It's not a room now.
Yes.
I have to go around.
I think we should.
Otherwise,
Yes. But it turns on one side. I realize that's the wall. It's like that happens even if they're put together again in November.
Shall I go to the reception and ask for the
Like there were
tell them that it's between now and
I don't know how to realize it, but I can understand. Perhaps it's the way of putting and explaining, because when you say not and together you put the idea of the opposition, it's like a clash with the you know, and that's why from the outside I really feel there can be opposition in reducing because I think that things go together, but I don't know, perhaps make it more complex. And this is your document?
Preparing for my doctoral research on how we can.
So do we need to move to this? Okay. This one?
Yeah, just this one. Just this one. Just going to come across here. And lectern a little bit as well. And the camera.
Yeah.
So. Just going to have to be moved. Don't go forwards. That's pretty strong. It's cool. I don't want to bash the wire, so that'll probably be alright.
Okay.
But I study and work in France since 10 years now, so that's why. Here. Yes.
We need to move this. This belongs there, right?
Yeah, I'm sending just that.
Sure.
Which one is where? Am I in this room or that room? I don't know.
This is room 2.
This is room 2? I think I'm in.
I have no idea.
This is room 2.
Yeah. Oh, I'm in room 1. Damn it, guys!
I will move between the rooms. I want to see a bit of everything. That's the thing. Yeah, like partition.
Yeah, thanks for partitioning, guys.
Again.
Partition was painful. I have my displacements and violence.
No, I want to really try and stay for dinner, but if I don't, someone eat my gnocchi.
I think that's no problem.
Because the problem is that the trains to High Wycombe is one.
But why don't you stay in your apartment?
What?
I thought you have this apartment now.
No, I know, but I don't want, like, I'm supposed to go to High Wycombe because I have to pick up tomorrow.
What we need to check is if the voices don't spill onto the show.
Well, if they do, we can't change it anymore. So, unless we have to de-link the computers as well. Unlink, however it's called. Unlink, yes.
Sorry?
I had to disconnect the two computers.
Ah, okay. Yeah, because it's the same.
Now we need.
If we just turn it on, I think it'll disconnect.
Let's go. Just let's just go ahead.
Wow.